Hey there, it's Pastor Rob. Tomorrow, we're going to be looking at a passage here at Sunnyslope in Ephesians that is sometimes known as the armor of God. And what I like to do and what I want to invite you in to do with me is to just spend a few minutes studying this passage. What we're going to do in the next few minutes together is just walk through the passage. I haven't really done a whole lot of study on it yet. I've kind of laid out the text in a way that you can see how each phrase kind of follows one after the other, but that's it. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to kind of look at some of the words and ideas that are presented here, and together we're going to try to get at least a basic understanding of what this text is all about. And then I invite you tomorrow to join me in worship as you'll hear a message on this text. So let's jump in. I'm going to put my screen up so that you can see it. And here you can now see what you have in front of you is the text, and you can kind of see how I've laid this out. I put each separate phrase on a line, and that way it's kind of the general rule is one verb per line. And that way you can it helps you to follow the order and the logic of thought in a passage. And I do this for just about every text when I'm getting ready to preach it. So let's start. We're going to start with the word finally. That's obviously a word that points to a conclusion. Paul is bringing his letter to an end, and so we're looking at the very last thing that Paul wants to say to us. And I notice that he has a number of imperatives. Now, an imperative is simply a command or a prohibition. It's telling you to do something. It's not describing the way something is. It's actually giving a command. And you'll notice that there's a couple of them here. We're going to highlight them here. Be strong, put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of evil. Imperatives are helpful because they help us to zero in on what God is actually instructing us to do, what he specifically wants us to do in a text. And so imperatives are always really helpful to identify. But then I notice that there's a word that's repeated at least a couple of times here, and that's the word strong. Be strong in the strength of his might. Now, might is actually a different word, I think. So I'm going to put a little question mark there. That's going to just remind me to go back and take a look at what the difference is between these two words here, if there is anything that is different. And what does it mean to stand in the strength of his might? I have some ideas about that, but I want to go back and dig a little bit deeper. It seems that I think what it is important to say is that Paul is emphasizing that the strength that we are to stand in is not our own strength, but it's the strength of the Lord that he gives to us. And that reminds us that the strength that we need is going to come from outside of ourselves. You'll notice that Paul emphasizes, there's another word that begins to come up as we move into the next section. He talks about putting on the whole armor of God, but then he comes to this word repeatedly of stand. And I'll notice that I happen to notice it a couple times in the text there, down in verse 13, then again in verse 14, stand therefore, stand firm. I thought there was maybe one more time, but maybe not. If we come to it, we'll find it. We'll highlight it then. So notice also this is kind of where there's a logical flow in thinking. So here's put on. This is what he's telling you to do, and then there's a sort of a purpose clause. A purpose clause says this is why you're doing something. So you're commanded to do something, and why is it that you're doing it? Well, it's that you may be able to stand. Just for grammar people, there's two verbs here, that you may be able to stand, and then so this is actually the infinitive. That's again, that's a grammar technicality, but it's the main verb there is being able and then to stand. So we don't need to get too much into the nuances of that for right now, but just understand that the purpose, the whole reason that we're to put on the armor of God is that we may stand. And then he goes on against the schemes of the devil. Now, I don't know about you. We live in a very Western rational culture. And so when we hear the words of the devil. We think these pointy little horn things that didn't turn out very pointy, but and then the long sort of pitchfork tail, right? And we are, I think, naturally adverse to that. We have this mentality towards the spiritual realm that's not always. We're actually pretty skeptical about it, and that's we can hear these ideas about schemes of the devil and all this stuff about authorities, cosmic powers, spiritual forces, and that sounds, in some ways, that sounds rather fantastical to us. It sounds otherworldly, and we may become very skeptical of that. But I think it's important to recognize that we are very much shaped by the forces of our own culture. And what I mean by that is that we should question those assumptions. We shouldn't just take for granted the cultural assumptions that we hold. In other words, we may be skeptical about the idea of spiritual forces and so on, but we should at least ask, why are we so skeptical, and where did that skepticism come from? What makes us so confident that our modern Enlightenment thinking, our rational and reasonable thinking, is the absolute certainty and the final word on the nature of reality? Why are we so quick to reject an idea and an assumption that was taken for granted for many thousands of years? Why are we so quick to reject that? At the very least, we should ask that question, which we will, and we'll get more into that a little bit later. Okay, moving on. The armor of God, Paul begins that here, the whole armor of God, and then he repeats it back down again here. And that tells me a little bit that one of the ways that Paul is doing this is, this is sort of typical Paul, where he starts off saying something, be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might, put on the whole armor of God. But then he sort of gets distracted, and maybe not distracted, but he takes this lengthy tangent here. And we know that he does that in part because he kind of repeats the phrase, put on the whole armor of God, take up the whole armor of God. And in between, he uses the word, for we do not. And that's really what he's doing in there. He's sort of offering a kind of an explanation, or he's offering maybe a clarification. And the clarification is actually really, really important. And I'm going to say more about this probably in the message. But Paul is reminding us who our enemy is and is not. And this is critical, because you'll notice what he does is he says it's not against flesh and blood right here. It's not against flesh and blood, but, and this is, it's a contrast. So anytime you see the word not and but, that's a contrastive. So not this, but this instead. And here's what we are wrestling with. The reason that matters is because flesh and blood represents, people and individuals. You might say the people that you can see, the realm that you can see. And the problem is, and why this is so important, is because typically we actually make the mistake of seeing people as our enemy, people that hold different ideologies, people that hold different beliefs from us, people that embrace a different way of thinking and living. And we tend to treat them as the enemy. We look down on them. We can be very critical, and we can be very judgmental of them, because on some level we perceive them to be the enemy. And what Paul is doing is he's clarifying this here. And I love how he repeats this word here. Against. What is he saying? Our real enemy is the rulers, authorities, cosmic powers, and spiritual forces in the heavenly places. Our real enemy is not people, but it's actually spiritual forces that exist almost behind the scenes. C.S. Lewis talks about this. He says that the real reality, the ultimate reality, is sort of behind the curtain. There's much more going on behind the scenes that we can't readily see. And what Paul wants to remind us of is that is in fact the case. So yes, on one level, we hear this today in our modern rationalist way of thinking and understanding reality, and we immediately dismiss this. But we should not be so quick to do that. There is a spiritual realm. There is a spiritual dimension. And there's much going on there, and that's where the real enemy exists. That's what Paul says. So that's why he can then come later on, and he can say therefore. And therefore, as you've heard me say, is always a word you have to ask, what is it there for? And what it's there for is to say, because all this is true, because we have this cosmic enemy that we are up against, we have to do something. And that's where then he repeats that word again. He says, put on the whole armor of God. So because we're against the spiritual realm, what do we need to do? Well, we need to prepare ourselves for spiritual battle. And that's what he's detailing here. That you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand firm, stand. And he repeats then that word therefore. So you just make a note of that. Here's where he lays out what the armor of God actually is. Oh, and I guess I missed one because I'll just erase that because it does go a little bit further, doesn't it? He actually goes down. Oops, don't want to keep erasing stuff. He actually keeps on going down, and he includes this as well. Probably we could look in detail at every single one of the pieces of armor, and I suspect that there's a tendency to sort of allegorize and maybe over allegorize each piece of armor. In other words, the helmet or the belt of truth goes on the waist because it needs to hold the whole body together, something like that. I'm sure there are different ways that we could sort of overdo the connections that Paul is making. I'm not so sure that that's the case. Maybe I'm wrong. This is where I'm going to do a little more study. Why does Paul choose the specific piece of armor, and does that correspond to the virtue that he's talking about? I'm not so sure about that, but we'll do some digging into that. That's one of the questions that we want to ask, and we'll see if we can learn any more about that. Okay, well, we're at the bottom of our page, and unfortunately, that means we have to kind of erase everything we've done so far if we want to look at the concluding piece of the passage. But we will do that. And there's not much more, unfortunately. So we've just lost all of our drawing, but that's okay. Now, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time going through each piece of armor, other than to just note that he's got oops, where did my marker go? Here we go. He emphasizes quite a few different things here, and these are all the things that we need. Oops, didn't work quite right. My bad. Let's try this again. There we go. The armor is listed all here and goes all the way down to the very end. Stand therefore firm. And he talks about, truth, and they're all virtues, right? Truth and righteousness. The readiness given by the gospel of peace, faith, salvation, the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. So these are all things that prepare us to face the evil in this world. Again, there's a connection here. These things all are going to prepare us for facing the cosmic powers that are at work. But then you'll have to remember, again, we have to always tie that back. The strength that we need is not from ourselves. We're not called to be strong in ourselves, but to stand in the strength that God gives us. So we've really just kind of cracked open the door a little bit. We've walked through this passage. We've made some notes about the grammar. We've made some notes about how these different words and phrases are all related. What we have to do next is we have to dig a little bit deeper. We want to try to unpack this more. We want to try to look at some of the different words that are used. We want to try to look at where does this fit maybe in the larger context of Ephesians, and how does it fit in the larger context of the whole Bible. So that's what comes next. And then, of course, we want to try to understand what does this say to us today? What are some of the things that we have in common with Paul's day? How do we experience weakness? How do we see the power and the principalities at work? And then how can we then go out and face those? That's kind of the next step. And so that's where we'll be heading from here. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time when we do our Bible study.